6 months later, the community garden won a local award for Best New Green Space. David was invited to a ceremony at City Hall, where the mayor shook his hand and a reporter took his picture. The article ran on the front page of the local paper, above the fold. Richard saw it. He was standing in his kitchen, drinking his morning coffee, when he glanced at the headline. Neighbor turns vacant lot into thriving community garden after legal battle. The photo showed David, smiling, holding a trowel, surrounded by children and flowers. Richard crumpled the newspaper and threw in the trash. He walked to his window and looked out at the fence, the beautiful, solid, 8-foot fence that blocked his view of everything he had once taken for granted. He could not see the garden. He could not see the neighbors. He could not see the sunsets. He turned away from the window and walked into his dark living room. Outside, the roses bloomed. The children laughed. The garden grew. And David sat on his bench, at peace, finally, absolutely victorious. David had always believed that a good fence made for good neighbors. He had read that proverb somewhere. Probably on a Pinterest board his ex-wife had forced him to browse during their short-lived attempt at home renovation. Back then, the idea had seemed quaint, a gentle reminder that boundaries were healthy, that respect needed physical markers. Now, standing in his backyard on a humid Monday evening, he realized that the proverb was missing a crucial addendum. Unless your neighbor is a rich, arrogant jackass who thinks the world bends to his will. The fence had appeared sometime between Friday morning and Sunday night, while David was away on a business trip. He had driven to Chicago for a pharmaceutical supply conference, 3 days of stale coffee, PowerPoint presentations, and awkward networking. He had returned home tired, slightly hungover from one too many airport margaritas, and desperate for the comfort of his own garden. His sanctuary, the one place in the world where David felt truly at peace. He had bought the house 5 years ago, after the divorce. It was a modest 2-bedroom ranch in a quiet suburban neighborhood called Oak Haven, 40 minutes outside the city. The yard was his pride and joy, not because it was large or lavish, but because he had transformed it with his own hands. Flower beds lined the eastern side, bursting with hydrangeas and lavender. A small vegetable patch hugged the southern fence. And in the back corner, under the old maple tree, he had built a wooden bench where he drank his morning coffee and watched the sunrise. Now, as he walked up his driveway, he froze. A fence, a massive, expensive, cedar plank fence, at least 6 feet tall, stretching along the entire western boundary of his property. It was beautiful, in an obnoxious way, the kind of fence that belonged around a gated community or a celebrity estate, not a modest suburban lot. The wood was stained a dark walnut, with decorative caps on each post, and a gate that probably cost more than David's monthly mortgage. Richard's fence. It had to be. Richard Barrington III was David's next-door neighbor to the west. He was a man in his early 50s with a permanent tan, teeth so white they looked photoshopped, and a laugh that sounded like a car engine failing to start. He had inherited his house from his parents, a sprawling, 6-bedroom colonial that dwarfed every other property on the block, and he had spent the last 3 years renovating it into a monument to his own ego. A marble fountain in the front yard, a 3-car garage with a Tesla and a Mercedes, a security camera pointed directly at David's driveway. Richard was the kind of neighbor who waved with 2 fingers instead of his whole hand, the kind who corrected your grammar in casual conversation, the kind who had once complained to the homeowners association because David's trash cans were visible from the street for 15 minutes after pickup. And now, apparently, the kind who built fences without consulting his neighbors. David walked closer, his heart beginning to pound. The fence was set back from what he had always believed was the property line. He could see it immediately. The old boundary was marked by a row of weathered wooden stakes his father had helped him install when he first moved in. Those stakes were now on Richard's side of the fence, by at least 4 feet. His flower beds, his beloved hydrangeas, the ones that had taken 3 years to reach their full glory. They were crushed against the new fence, their branches bent and broken, their blooms pressed into the cedar planks like prisoners against a cell wall. The lavender had been trampled. The decorative gravel path he had laid last summer was now a narrow, useless strip. David's hands began to shake, not from fear, from anger, a cold, focused anger that he had not felt since the day his ex-wife had told him she was leaving. He pulled out his phone and took photos, a dozen of them from every angle. The bent flower beds, the crushed gravel, the old boundary stakes, now stranded on Richard's side of the fence. He noted the time and date in a notebook he kept in his back pocket, a habit from his days as a project manager. Then he walked back inside, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down at his kitchen table. He needed a plan. He needed evidence. And above all, he needed to keep his cool. Losing his temper would only make things worse. Monday morning, the surveyor. David called 3 surveyors before finding one willing to come out on short notice. The first 2 quoted prices that made his eyes water, $2,500 and $3,000, both with additional travel expenses and court reporting fees if the matter ended up in legal proceedings. The third was a retired civil engineer named Frank, who lived just 2 streets away and was known for being both meticulous and reasonably priced. "I don't cut corners," Frank said, showing up at 8 a.m. with a theodolite, a metal detector, and a thermos of coffee that smelled like burnt regret. "And I don't play favorites. If your neighbor built that fence on your land, I'll find out. If he didn't, I'll tell you that too." "Fair. Fair," David said. They spent the next 3 hours walking the property lines. Frank dug up old survey pins, some of them buried so deep they hadn't seen daylight in decades. He measured, calculated, cross-referenced with county records, and then measured again. David followed him like a shadow, holding the metal detector, carrying the tripod, asking questions he already knew the answers to. At 11:15 a.m., Frank stood up, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and pointed to the fence. "The original property line runs here," he said, tapping his boot against a buried iron pin he had just uncovered. "You can see the old stakes your father put in. They're about 4 feet west of the fence. Richard's new fence is 4 feet, 3 inches onto your side, to be precise. That's a significant encroachment. In square footage, he's stolen about 480 square feet of your land." David stared at the pin, then at the fence, then at the crushed flower beds. "For feet," he whispered. 3 inches. "And he's not going to give it back," Frank said grimly. "Men like Richard Barrington don't make mistakes. They take what they want and dare you to stop them. I've seen this before. He's hoping you'll either not notice or not have the resources to fight him." "What do I do?" Frank packed up his equipment. "First, get a lawyer. Second, document everything. Third, don't let him see you sweat. Rich bullies like him feed on fear. Show him you're serious, and he might back down." Might. David paid Frank $800 for the survey, plus a $100 tip for coming out on such short notice. Then he walked back to his house, sat down at the kitchen table, and sent an email to every real estate attorney within a 20-mile radius. Subject: neighbor encroachment. Survey evidence in hand. Need consultation. He attached the photos. He attached Frank's preliminary report. And then he waited. The confrontation. Richard's house was a monument to excess. The marble fountain burbled cheerfully in the front yard, spraying water over a bronze statue of a heron that looked more like a pterodactyl. The Tesla was parked in the driveway, its matte black finish gleaming under the midday sun. Richard himself was standing on his front porch, wearing a salmon-colored polo shirt and white linen pants, talking on his phone in a voice loud enough to be heard 3 houses down. David walked up the driveway, his heart hammering but his face calm. He had changed into a clean polo shirt, navy blue, because he refused to dress like a cocktail waiter, and he was carrying a manila folder containing the survey results and the photos. He waited at the bottom of the porch steps until Richard finished his call. "Richard," David said, keeping his voice level, "we need to talk about the fence." Richard looked at him with the mild disinterest of a cat watching a mouse. "David, good to see you. Like the fence? I had it custom made. Cedar from Oregon. Cost more than your car, probably. It's 4 feet onto my property." A pause. Richard's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of annoyance, quickly suppressed. "I don't think so," Richard said. "My contractors are the best in the state. They don't make mistakes. They surveyed the property lines themselves." "I had a professional surveyor out this morning," David said, opening the folder. "His name is Frank. He's a licensed civil engineer with 30 years of experience. He found the original property pins. He measured the encroachment. It's 4 feet, 3 inches. He held out the survey report. Here's the documentation." Richard didn't take the folder. He looked at it the way a person might look at a dead squirrel on the sidewalk, briefly, dismissively, with a faint curl of the lip. "I'm sure your little surveyor friend means well," Richard said. "But my contractors use GPS mapping and satellite imagery. They're infallible." "You're mistaken." "I'm not mistaken," David said. "And I'm not going to let this go. You've destroyed my flower beds. You've taken almost 500 square feet of my land. I want the fence moved back to the correct property line, and I want it done within 30 days. Richard laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, a bark rather than a chuckle. "You want," he said, stepping down one stair so that he loomed over David. "You want? Listen to me, David. I've been in this neighborhood for 25 years. My family built half the houses on this block. I have lawyers on retainer who charge more per hour than you make in a week. My contractors don't make mistakes. Go ahead and sue me if you want, but my lawyers will drag this out for years until you're broke. You don't have the money, the time, or the stomach for that fight." He smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile, the kind that belonged on a shark. "Now, why don't you go back to your little garden and your little bench and leave the property disputes to people who can afford them?" David David stood perfectly still. The folder trembled in his hands, but he did not let his face show anything. He had expected arrogance. He had expected dismissal. He had not expected Richard to be so brazen, so open about his intention to use wealth as a weapon, but in a strange way that made things easier. Because now David knew exactly who he was dealing with. Not a neighbor who had made an honest mistake. Not a contractor's error that could be resolved with a polite conversation. A thief, a bully, a man who had looked at someone else's land and decided to take it, simply because he could. "Okay," David said quietly. "Thank you for your time." He turned and walked back down the driveway. Behind him, Richard laughed again, louder this time, as if he had already forgotten the conversation. David did not look back. The quiet aftermath. That night, David sat on his wooden bench under the maple tree, staring at the fence. The sun had set, and the cedar planks were dark silhouettes against the last orange glow of the horizon. The hydrangeas were still crushed. The lavender was still trampled. But something had shifted inside him. He was not afraid of Richard Barrington. He was not afraid of his lawyers, or his money, or his threats. He was, however, very, very angry. And anger, he had learned over the years, was a fuel. You could either let it burn you from the inside, or you could use it to light a fire under your own feet. He pulled out his phone and called the first attorney who had responded to his email, a woman named Sophia Chun, whose website promised aggressive representation for property disputes and whose reviews mentioned the word pitbull more than once. "Sophia Chun," she answered on the second ring. "This is David Morrison. I emailed you about a fence encroachment. I remember. For feet, 3 inches, neighbor with more money than sense. I read your survey report. You have a strong case. He told me his lawyers would drag it out for years until I went broke." Sophia laughed. It was a warm, genuine sound, nothing like Richard's mocking bark. They always say that, and sometimes they're right. But sometimes, Mr. Morrison, the other side makes a mistake. They get overconfident. They leave a trail, and that's when we strike. What do you recommend? Come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring everything, the survey, the photos, any correspondence you've had with the neighbor. I'll review the file and give you a strategy. In the meantime, do not touch the fence. Do not confront him again. Do not post anything on social media. Let him think he's won. David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I can do that." "Good. And Mr. Morrison?" "Yes. Don't let him see you sweat. The best revenge is a quiet, legal, perfectly executed plan." David hung up, looked at the fence one more time, and smiled. Richard thought he had won. Richard thought his money and his lawyers and his arrogant swagger would scare David into submission. Richard thought he could steal 4 feet of land and get away with it. Richard had no idea what was coming. The research begins. Over the next week, David became a student of property law. He read county ordinances, zoning regulations, and historical plat maps. He learned about adverse possession, easements, and the difference between a boundary dispute and a trespass. He spent hours at the county recorder's office, digging through dusty ledgers and microfiche records. Sophia Chun was impressed. "You're better than half my paralegals," she said at their second meeting. "But knowledge alone isn't enough. We need leverage. Tell me about Richard. What does he value? What is he afraid of?" David thought about it. His reputation, his status. He's always bragging about his family's history in the neighborhood. He thinks he's the unofficial mayor of Oak Haven. Sophia nodded slowly. "So we make this public. Not a lawsuit, not yet. A quiet conversation with the homeowners association. A letter to the county zoning board. A few carefully placed questions at the next neighborhood meeting. People like Richard hate being embarrassed in front of their peers. And if that doesn't work, then we sue. But we do it smart. We don't just ask for the fence to be moved. We ask for damages. We ask for legal fees. We make it so expensive for him to fight that settling becomes the cheaper option." David left her office feeling lighter than he had in days. He had a plan. He had a lawyer. And he had something Richard had clearly underestimated: patience. Richard could afford to be impatient. He had money, power, and a fleet of lawyers on retainer. But David had something better. He had time. He had resolve. And he had a crushed flower bed full of hydrangeas that were not going to forgive or forget. That night, he walked out to his backyard, stood at the edge of the fence, and placed his hand on the cedar planks. For feet, 3 inches, almost 500 square feet of stolen land. "You made a mistake, Richard," he said quietly. "Not the fence. That was deliberate. Your mistake was thinking I wouldn't fight back." He turned and walked inside, leaving the fence to guard a strip of land that was still his, legally and morally, even if Richard's cedar planks claimed otherwise. The battle had just begun. 1 week later, the attorney's office. Sophia Chin's office was on the 8th floor of a glass tower downtown, with a view of the city skyline that made David feel like he was peering into a world he didn't belong to. The furniture was modern. Sleek leather chairs, a chrome and glass desk, abstract art on the walls that looked like someone had spilled paint and called it genius. But Sophia herself was anything but abstract. She was sharp, direct, and utterly without pretense. She had spread David's survey, photos, and county records across her desk like a general planning a campaign. Her reading glasses were perched on her nose, and she tapped a pen against her chin as she reviewed the documents for the 3rd time. "You have a strong case," she said finally. The survey is ironclad. The photos are clear. Richard's fence is 4 feet, 3 inches onto your property. In any sane jurisdiction, you would win a summary judgment within 60 days. David's heart lifted. So we file tomorrow? Sophia took off her glasses and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and warning. It's not that simple, David. I need to be honest with you about the reality of property disputes in this county. She turned her laptop toward him, revealing a calendar. This is the civil docket for the Superior Court of O County. As you can see, every single day for the next 18 months is already booked. We have one judge handling all real property cases. One, and she's swamped with foreclosure disputes, easement battles, and adverse possession claims that have been pending for years. David's stomach sank. How long are we talking? To get a trial date? 14 to 18 months, minimum. And that's if we file tomorrow, if the judge doesn't grant continuances, and if Richard's lawyers don't file a dozen motions to delay, which they will. She paused, and then there's the cost. She pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. Filing fees, service of process, depositions, expert witnesses, court reporters, and my hourly rate, she explained. For a contested boundary dispute that goes all the way to trial, a conservative estimate would be between $40,000 and $60,000. And if Richard decides to drag things out, which I suspect he will, the total cost could easily climb into 6 figures. David felt the air leave his lungs. 6 figures? He repeated in disbelief. Legal fees add up fast. Every time Richard's lawyers file a motion to dismiss, I have to respond. Every time they request a continuance, I have to prepare. Every deposition, every hearing, every hour of preparation, it all costs money. She leaned forward. I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm saying this so you understand what you're up against. Richard is betting that you'll look at those numbers and give up. He's betting that you don't have the resources to fight. David stared at the spreadsheet. $40,000, $60,000, more than he made in a year after taxes. He had savings, about $25,000, carefully accumulated over 5 years of frugal living. But that was his emergency fund, his retirement, his safety net. If he spent it all on lawyers, he would have nothing left. And there was no guarantee he would win. Even if he did, he might not be able to collect damages from Richard, who could afford to tie things up in appeals for years. What about small claims court? David asked. The fence is worth less than $10,000. The small claims court has a jurisdictional limit of $10,000 in this state, she explained. Your claim involves real property, not just the fence itself. The disputed land, roughly 4 feet by 120 feet, is worth well over $20,000 at current market rates. Because of that, the case falls outside the scope of small claims court. David frowned. So what does that mean? It means small claims won't touch it, she replied. If you want to pursue this, you'll need to file in Superior Court. David leaned back in his chair, defeated. So what do I do? Just let him keep my land? Sophia shook her head. No, but you need to think strategically. A traditional lawsuit is not your only option. There are other ways to pressure Richard. Administrative complaints, zoning violations, HOA disputes. Those are cheaper and faster. Not as powerful as a court order, but they can create leverage. Will they get my land back? Eventually, maybe, but the fence will stay for months, possibly years. And in the meantime, she hesitated. In the meantime, Richard will do everything he can to make your life miserable. He wants you to give up. He wants you to sell your house and move. Don't give him that satisfaction. David left her office with a heavy heart. He had come looking for a sword. He had left with a pamphlet about patience and a bill for the consultation. The concrete patio. 2 weeks later, David came home from work to the sound of jackhammers. He walked around the side of his house and felt his blood turn to ice. Richard's contractors were back. Not just building a fence this time, but pouring concrete. A massive, sprawling patio extension, at least 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, extending right up to the fence on the stolen side of the property line. The concrete was smooth and gray, with decorative scoring that made it look like expensive tile. There was a built-in fire pit, a built-in grill, and electrical conduits for outdoor speakers and lights. It was the kind of patio that belonged in a magazine, not in a suburban backyard. And every inch of it was on David's land. He watched as a worker smoothed the wet concrete with a long-handled trowel. Another worker was installing a pergola over the fire pit, a wooden structure that would cast shade over the seating area. Richard himself was standing at the edge of the construction, sipping something from a crystal tumbler, directing the workers with lazy gestures. David walked to the fence, his fence on his land, and called out, "Richard." Richard turned, a smile playing on his lips. "David, hope the noise isn't bothering you. Just making some improvements. You know how it is. That patio is on my property. Is it?" Richard looked at the concrete, then at David, then back at the concrete. "I don't see a name on it. Looks like my land to me. You have the survey. You know where the property line is." Richard took a slow sip from his tumbler. David, I told you. My contractors don't make mistakes. The fence is on the line. The patio is on my side. If you have a problem, take it up with my lawyers." I'll give you their number." He laughed, that same barking, dismissive laugh, and turned his back on David. David stood there for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The concrete was still wet. If he wanted to, he could walk over there, stomp his boots into it, ruin it completely. But that would be vandalism. That would give Richard exactly what he wanted. An excuse to call the police, file charges, paint David as the crazy, unhinged neighbor. No, he wouldn't give Richard that satisfaction. He walked back inside, closed the blinds, and sat in his dark living room until the jackhammers fell silent. The mockery. The patio was completed in 4 days. It was, David had to admit, gorgeous. The fire pit crackled with gas flames that could be controlled by a remote. The pergola was draped with string lights that twinkled at dusk. The grill was the size of a small car. And Richard wasted no time showing it off. That Saturday, he threw a party. Not a small, quiet gathering, a full-blown extravaganza. There were catering trucks parked on the street, a live band set up on the lawn, and at least 50 guests milling around the backyard. The music was loud enough to rattle David's windows. The laughter was louder. David sat on his wooden bench under the maple tree, watching through the slats of the fence. He could see snippets of the party. A woman in a red dress laughing at something. A man in a blazer gesturing with a wine glass. Richard himself holding court near the fire pit, his head thrown back in triumph. At one point, Richard walked over to the fence that was 4 feet onto David's land, and leaned against it, looking directly at David's house. He raised his glass in a mock toast. "To good neighbors." Richard shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. The crowd laughed. David did not move. He did not react. He simply sat on his bench in the dark and watched. The party went on until 2 a.m. The music didn't stop until the police showed up, called by another neighbor, not David. Richard greeted the officers with easy charm, apologized profusely, and turned the volume down just enough to be legal. By the time the last guest left, David's head was pounding and his heart was full of something he hadn't felt in years. Not just anger, determination, the loophole hunt. The next morning, David skipped church. He wasn't religious and drove to the county records office. He arrived at 8 a.m., just as the doors opened, and he didn't leave until they closed at 5 p.m. He spent the day in the basement, surrounded by filing cabinets and microfiche machines. He pulled every record related to Richard's property. The original deed from 1985, the inheritance transfer from Richard's parents, every survey, every permit, every zoning variance. He spread them out on a long table and began to read. 3 hours in, he found something interesting. The property next to Richard's house, the lot on the other side, opposite David's, had been sold 5 years ago to a limited liability company called Barrington Holdings, LLC. David recognized the name. Barrington was Richard's middle name. He had incorporated dozens of shell companies over the years, presumably for tax purposes. But this lot was different. It was narrow, only 40 feet wide, and it had been empty for as long as David could remember. Just a patch of grass and weeds, wedged between Richard's house and the house of an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson. According to county records, the lot was zoned for single-family residential, but no one had ever built on it. David checked the tax records. Barrington Holdings, LLC was delinquent on the property taxes. Not by a lot, just a few $1,000s, but enough to indicate that Richard had lost interest in the lot. Maybe he had bought it as an investment and forgotten about it. Maybe he was planning to sell it. An idea began to form in David's mind. It was a crazy idea, a risky idea, the kind of idea that could backfire spectacularly or change everything. He pulled out his phone and called Sophia Chun. "Sophia, I need you to look into a property for me. 217 Elm Street. It's the empty lot next to Richard's house. Tell me who owns it, what it's worth, and whether it's for sale." Sophia was silent for a moment. "What are you thinking, David?" "I'm thinking that Richard stole 4 feet of my land on one side, and I'm thinking that maybe I can buy the lot on his other side, the one that touches his property line, and do what with it?" David smiled for the first time in weeks. "I'm going to build something that will make his precious patio and his fancy fence look like the worst investment he ever made." The research deepens. Over the next 2 weeks, David became a phantom in the county records office. He learned about setback requirements, building codes, and nuisance ordinances. He discovered that the empty lot at 217 Elm Street was zoned for a single-family home, but there was no restriction on the size of the home, only the footprint. And the footprint could be as large as 80% of the lot. He also discovered something delicious. Richard's house was built right up to the property line on the Elm Street side. No setback, no buffer, just a wall of brick with a row of basement windows that were barely above ground level. If someone were to build on the empty lot next door, right up to the property line, they would be within their legal rights. And they would be within spitting distance of Richard's basement windows. David called Sophia. "Can I do this? Can I buy that lot and build something that will block Richard's light, his view, his access?" Sophia laughed. "Legally? Absolutely. The lot is zoned for residential construction. As long as you comply with the building codes, you can build right up to the property line. Richard has no easement, no right to light, no claim to that airspace. He can't stop you. And if he sues, he can try, but he would lose. You will be using your own property for a lawful purpose. The fact that it annoys your neighbor is not a legal problem. It's a feature." David hung up and went for a walk. He walked past the empty lot, imagining a structure there. Not a house. That would be too expensive, too permanent. Something else. Something tall. Something that would block Richard's western view, his afternoon sun, his precious privacy. A wall. A windowless wall. A two-story, windowless wall, painted a cheerful color with a security camera pointed directly at Richard's patio. He pulled out his phone and called a real estate agent. "I want to make an offer on 217 Elm Street. Cash. Close in 30 days. The agent sputtered. "But it's just an empty lot. No utilities. No plans." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The purchase. 3 weeks later, David stood on the empty lot, holding a set of keys. The sale had gone through without a hitch. Barrington Holdings LLC had been happy to unload the property. Richard apparently needed the cash for his patio renovations, and David had paid $35,000, most of his savings. It was a ridiculous amount of money for a patch of grass and weeds. But it was his patch of grass and weeds, and it was adjacent to Richard's house. On the side Richard had never bothered to protect. He walked to the property line, the legal boundary marked by a rusted iron pin, and looked at Richard's house. The brick wall was close. Too close by modern standards, but grandfathered in because it was built before the current zoning codes. The basement windows were at ground level, covered with grimy glass blocks. If David built on his new lot, he could block those windows completely. No light, no air, just a wall. He pulled out his phone and called a contractor. Not one of Richard's overpriced artisans, but no-nonsense builder named Miguel who had renovated David's kitchen 2 years ago. "Miguel, I need you to build me a wall. 10 feet tall, 20 feet long. Cinder block, stucco finish. No windows, no doors. Just a wall." Miguel was quiet for a moment. "You want me to build a wall on an empty lot? Why?" "To block my neighbor's view." Another pause. Then Miguel laughed. "I've done weirder things. Send me the address. I'll get you a quote." David sent the address. Then he walked back to his own house, passing the fence that Richard had built on stolen land. He didn't feel angry anymore. He felt something better. He felt anticipation. Richard had laughed at him, had mocked him, had dared him to sue. But Richard had forgotten one thing. David was no longer playing by Richard's rules. The lawsuit was a trap. The courts were a dead end. But the loophole, the empty lot, the zoning codes, the right to build on his own property, that was a door. And David had just walked through it. 2 weeks after buying the empty lot, David had been patient. He had spent his savings on a narrow strip of land at 217 Elm Street, and he had hired Miguel to start drawing up plans for the wall. But something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake, a question he hadn't fully answered. Why had Richard never bought that lot? It was the perfect piece of land for someone like Richard, a man who craved space, privacy, and control. The lot was 40 feet wide and 120 feet deep, running the entire length of Richard's western property line. If Richard owned it, he could expand his backyard, build a guest house, or simply prevent anyone from building next to him. So why had he let it sit empty for years, owned by a shell company that was delinquent on its taxes? David decided to dig deeper. He returned to the county records office, this time with a specific mission. He pulled the deed for 217 Elm Street, not the shell company's ownership, but the chain of title going back decades. What he found made him sit down on a rickety wooden chair and stare at the microfiche screen for a full minute. The lot had originally been part of a larger parcel owned by a family named Kowalski. In 1998, the Kowalskis had subdivided the land, selling the eastern half to Richard's parents, the half that now held Richard's house, and keeping the western half as an investment. But the Kowalski family had moved to Florida in 2005, and they had sold the western half to an investor named Harold P. Zimmerman, who lived in Arizona. Harold P. Zimmerman. David searched the name in the county tax database. Zimmerman was 87 years old, according to public records, and he had owned the lot for nearly 20 years. He had never built on it. He had never leased it. He had simply paid the taxes, sometimes late, sometimes barely, and held on to it like a forgotten savings bond. But here was the interesting part. The lot was not part of Richard's property. Richard had no legal claim to it. He had been using it as an extension of his lawn and driveway for years. mowing the grass, parking his cars on the gravel strip, even planting a row of ornamental shrubs along the edge, but he did not own it. He was, in legal terms, a squatter, a wealthy, entitled squatter who had simply assumed that no one would ever challenge his use of the land. David pulled up the current tax status. The property taxes were delinquent again, 2 years overdue, totaling nearly $8,000 with penalties. Zimmerman had stopped paying attention. Maybe he was ill. Maybe he had forgotten he owned the lot. Maybe he was waiting for the right offer. David's heart began to race. He called Sophia Chun. Sophia, I need you to find contact information for Harold P. Zimmerman. He owns the lot next to Richard's house, the one Richard has been using as his personal lawn. I think he might be willing to sell. Sophia was quiet for a moment, then she let out a low whistle. David, do you understand what you're suggesting? If you buy that lot, you will own the land on both sides of Richard's house. The fence side and the opposite side. You'll have him boxed in. I know, that's not just revenge. That's a chess move. A brilliant one. She paused. I'll find Zimmerman. Give me 48 hours. The search for Harold P. Zimmerman. 48 hours turned into 72, but Sophia came through. She found Zimmerman living in a retirement community outside Tucson, Arizona. He was 87 years old, a widower, and according to his neighbor, a chatty woman named Dolores who answered the phone. He was sharp as a tack, but tired of dealing with his late wife's real estate portfolio. Dolores gave David Zimmerman's direct phone number. David stared at it for a full minute before dialing. A raspy, cautious voice answered on the fourth ring. Hello, Mr. Zimmerman. My name is David Morrison. I'm calling from out of state about a piece of property you own. The vacant lot on Elm Street in Oak Haven. A long pause. Then, the lot in Ohio, the one my wife bought back in '05. Actually, it's in this state, not Ohio. But yes, that lot. I'm interested in buying it. Zimmerman coughed. You and about 10 other people. I've had it on the market for 3 years. Had a realtor list it, then delisted it. Too much hassle. Everyone wants to lowball me. David's pulse quickened. I'm not looking to lowball you, sir. I'll pay fair market value. Cash. Quick closing. Another pause, longer this time. Why do you want it? It's just a patch of dirt. No utilitias, no foundation. Zoned for a single-family home. But you'd have to spend a fortune to build anything decent. David chose his words carefully. I have a complicated relationship with the neighbor. He's been using your land as if it were his own. Mowing it. Parking on it. I like to put a stop to that. Zimmerman laughed. A dry, wheezing sound. You mean Richard Barrington? The rich prick with the big house. Oh, I know all about him. He's been trespassing on my land for years. My wife used to get letters from his lawyers, trying to buy it for pennies on the dollar. She always said no. Too proud, I guess. Would you sell it to me? Son, I'm 87 years old. I've got a bad heart and a worse prostate. I don't need the money, but I don't need the headache either. If you can make me a fair offer, and I mean fair, not insulting, I'll sign the papers tomorrow. David named a price. $45,000. It was more than the tax assessed value, less than what Richard might have paid if he had bothered to negotiate. It was, in David's estimation, exactly fair. Zimmerman was quiet for 10 seconds. Then, $45,000 cash, closing in 30 days, no contingencies. You pay the back taxes. Done. Then you've got yourself a lot, Mr. Morrison. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork. Send me yours. David hung up, his hands trembling. He had just bought a second piece of land. This one far more significant than the narrow strip he had purchased weeks ago. This lot was 40 feet wide, 120 feet deep, and it ran the entire length of Richard's western property line. It was the land Richard had been using as his personal playground, his unofficial lawn, his overflow parking. And now it was David's. The financing. He had already spent most of his savings on the first lot, a $35,000 purchase that had wiped out his emergency fund and then some. What remained was about $8,000 in his checking account and a modest investment portfolio he had been planning to cash out. Even if he liquidated everything, he could probably gather no more than $15,000. It wasn't enough. He called Sophia. I need a loan, he said. Maybe a business loan. Something that doesn't require a mountain of collateral. Sophia paused for a moment. You own 2 properties now, your house and the lot you just purchased. Have you considered a home equity line of credit? The interest rate would be reasonable and you could repay it over time. My house isn't worth that much. It doesn't have to be, she replied. The bank will evaluate your overall assets, including the lot you recently acquired. And honestly, David, that property on Elm Street is undervalued. Once Richard learns you own it, he may be willing to pay a premium to buy it back. David had no intention of selling. He wanted to keep the lot. Still, he understood her reasoning. He submitted an application for a HELOC through his credit union. The approval process took 10 long days. During that time, he watched Richard host another backyard party. He watched him park his Mercedes on land that didn't belong to him. He watched him mow grass he had no legal claim to. David said nothing. He didn't wave. He didn't glare. He simply waited. 10 days later, the loan was approved for $50,000. The interest rate was 6.5%, and the monthly payments would be just over $500 for the next decade. It was a heavy obligation, but it was one David was willing to carry. He transferred the money into his account and wired the first $20,000 to Zimmerman's lawyer as earnest money. The rest would be paid at closing. The closing took place in a conference room at a title company 40 minutes from Oak Haven. David sat on one side of the table. Harold Zimmerman's daughter, a woman named Carol, who had power of attorney, sat on the other side. Carol was in her 60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "My father sends his regards," Carol said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "He also says to tell you that Richard Barrington is a sanctimonious windbag, and that he hopes you make his life miserable." David smiled. "Tell your father I'll do my best." The paperwork took an hour. Deed transfers, tax affidavits, title insurance, notarized signatures. David signed his name so many times that his hand cramped. But when it was over, Carol handed him a set of keys to a piece of land that had never had a lock, but which now belonged to him. The title agent handed him the recorded deed. David read it twice, savoring every word. This indenture, made this 15th day of April between Harold P. Zimmerman, grantor, and David Morrison, grantee, regarding the real property known as 217 Elm Street, Oak Haven, County of Oak, described as Lot 7 of the Kowalski subdivision, containing 4,800 square feet, more or less. 4,800 square feet. Land that Richard had used for years without permission. Land that now belonged to the man Richard had stolen from. David folded the deed carefully, placed it in his breast pocket, and drove home. For the next 2 weeks, David did nothing. He didn't post a sign on the lot. He didn't confront Richard. He didn't tell a single soul except Sophia and his brother. He simply watched. Richard continued to use the land as if nothing had changed. He parked his Tesla on the gravel strip. He let his dog run loose on the grass. He directed his landscaping crew to trim the shrubs along the edge, shrubs that were now, technically, David's shrubs. It was surreal. Richard had no idea that the ground beneath his feet had changed ownership. He had no idea that the man he had mocked, the man he had dared to sue, was now his neighbor on both sides. David spent his evenings sitting on his bench under the maple tree, looking at the fence that Richard had built on stolen land. He thought about the legal dead end, the backlogged courts, the tens of thousands of dollars he didn't have. He thought about Richard's arrogant laugh, his mock toast, his belief that money could buy anything. And then he thought about the deed in his fireproof safe, the deed that gave him ownership of the land Richard had taken for granted, the deed that gave him leverage. He wasn't going to sue Richard. He wasn't going to spend years in court. He was going to do something much simpler, much more elegant. He was going to build, not a wall, not yet. First, he was going to let Richard know, in the most public, most humiliating way possible, that the land he had been using as his own was no longer his to use. He called Miguel. "Miguel, forget the wall for now. I need you to do something else. I need you to install a chain link fence on the property line, on the other side of Richard's house, the side he's been using as his driveway. The empty lot, the one you just bought. Yes, I want a fence, 6 feet tall, with a gate that locks. And I want a sign, a big sign. It should say, 'Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted.'" Miguel Guisev. That's going to piss him off. That's the point. The installation. The fence went up on a Tuesday. David took the day off work. He arrived at the empty lot at 7 a.m., just as Miguel and his crew were unloading rolls of chain link fencing, steel posts, and a bag of quick-set concrete. They worked quickly, quietly, efficiently. By 10 a.m., the first section of fence was in place, a silver line of galvanized steel running along the property line that Richard had never bothered to check. By noon, the fence was complete, 6 feet tall, stretching the entire length of the lot. A gate near the street, secured with a heavy padlock, and a sign, bright yellow with black letters, bolted to the fence at eye level. "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." David stood back and admired their work. The fence was ugly. It was industrial, utilitarian, completely out of place in the manicured suburb of Oak Haven. It clashed with Richard's colonial architecture, his marble fountain, his precious Tesla. It was, in every sense, an eyesore, and it was perfectly legal. Miguel packed up his tools. "You want me to stay? He's going to lose his mind when he sees this." "I'm counting on it," David said. "But no, you can go. I'll handle the fallout." Miguel nodded, climbed into his truck, and drove away. David sat down on the grass, his grass now, and waited. Richard returned home at 4:30 p.m. David heard the Mercedes before he saw it. the low, throaty growl of an expensive engine. The car turned on at Elm Street, coasted toward Richard's driveway, and then stopped. David watched from behind the fence. He saw Richard's brake lights flare. He saw the car sit there, motionless, for a full 10 seconds. Then the door opened and Richard stepped out. He stood on the sidewalk, staring at the fence, at the sign, at the realization that the land he had been using for years was now blocked off, claimed, owned by someone else. He walked to the gate, tried the padlock, found it secure. He peered through the chain link, looking at the grass he had mowed, the gravel where he had parked, the shrubs he had trimmed. His face was red. His jaw was tight. Then he looked across the street and saw David. David was sitting on a folding chair he had brought from home, holding a cup of coffee, watching Richard with calm, steady eyes. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply sat there, a witness to his neighbor's dawning horror. Richard stormed across the street, his polished loafers slapping against the asphalt. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, pointing at the fence. David took a slow sip of his coffee. "It's a fence, Richard. You're familiar with the concept. You built one on my property not long ago. This is my land. I've been using it for 15 years. "No," David said, setting down his cup and standing up. "You've been trespassing on it for 15 years. The land belongs to Harold Zimmerman. Or rather, it belonged to him. Now it belongs to me." Richard's face went pale, then flushed. "That's impossible. I would have known if the lot was sold. I closed on it yesterday. The deed is recorded. You're welcome to check with the county." David pulled a folded copy of the deed from his pocket and held it up. "This is my land now. Every inch of it, and you're not welcome on it." "You can't do this," Richard sputtered. "I'll sue you. I'll tie this up in court for years." David smiled. It was a soft, genuine smile. The smile of a man who had finally found the high ground. "You know what, Richard? You're right. You can sue me. You have more money than I do. You have better lawyers. You could drag this out for years. But here's the difference. When you sue me, you won't be suing me over a fence. You'll be suing me for building a fence on my own property, and you will lose. Every judge in this county will laugh you out of the courtroom." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since David had met him, he had nothing to say. David folded the deed, tucked it back into his pocket, and picked up his folding chair. "Oh, and Richard, the fence you built on my property, the one that's 4 feet onto my land, I'm not going to sue you for that. Not yet. I'm going to let it stand. Because every time you look at that fence, I want you to remember that you're standing on land you stole. And every time you look at this fence," he gestured to the chain link, "I want you to remember that the land on the other side belongs to me." He turned and walked back to his house, leaving Richard standing on the sidewalk, speechless and defeated. Behind him, the chain link fence glittered in the afternoon sun. And on the other side of Richard's house, the cedar fence remained, a monument to arrogance, a reminder that sometimes the best revenge was not a lawsuit, but a quiet, legal, perfectly executed real estate play. Saturday morning, 7:15 a.m. The first sound Richard Barrington III heard that Saturday was not the gentle chirping of birds or the soft rustle of wind through his expensive imported ornamental grasses. It was the roar of a diesel engine, followed by the clank of heavy metal, followed by the unmistakable beep-beep-beep of a construction truck backing up. He groaned, rolled over, and looked at his nightstand clock. 7:15 a.m. on a weekend. The audacity. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Let the peasants make their noise. He would call the homeowners association on Monday and file a complaint. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, more insistent. And then came the shouting, voices he didn't recognize, barking orders, the clatter of tools being unloaded. Richard threw off his silk sheets, grabbed his burgundy bathrobe, and stomped to the window. He pulled back the curtain and froze. His side lawn, the wide, manicured stretch of grass that ran along the western edge of his property, the one he had always considered his own private buffer zone, was swarming with people. A flatbed truck was parked on the street, loaded with concrete barriers, heavy steel posts, and stacks of lumber. A second truck carried a small excavator. A third carried rolls of chain-link fencing and bags of quick-set concrete. At least a dozen men in hard hats and high-vis vests were already spreading out across the lawn, measuring, marking, digging. And standing in the middle of it all, holding a clipboard and a steaming cup of coffee, was David. David Morrison, his neighbor, his victim, the man Richard had stolen 4 feet of land from, the man he had mocked at his patio party, the man he had dared to sue until he went broke. David was wearing jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt. He looked perfectly at ease. He was nodding at something one of the foremen was saying, pointing at a spot on the ground, making a note on his clipboard. Richard's blood turned to fire. He stormed down the stairs, threw open his front door, and ran outside in his bathrobe, his bare feet slapping against the cold flagstone of his walkway. He didn't care that he looked ridiculous. He didn't care that the construction workers were staring. All he could see was David, smug, calm, infuriating David, standing on his lawn, directing his workers as if he owned the place. What the hell do you think you're doing? Richard screamed, his voice cracking with rage. The workers paused. A few of them exchanged glances. One of them, a burly man with a gray beard, muttered something that sounded like, "Here we go." David turned slowly, coffee cup in hand, and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had been patient, who had waited, who had finally reached the moment he had been planning for weeks. "Good morning, Richard. Nice bathrobe. Is that silk? Get off my property," Richard shouted, pointing a trembling finger at David. "You have no right to be here. I'm calling the police. I'm calling my lawyers. I'll have you arrested for trespassing." David took a sip of his coffee, completely unruffled. Richard, you really should check your facts before you start screaming. I'm not on your property. I'm on my property. That's my lawn. I've owned this land for 25 years. Have you, though? David reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded stack of papers. He walked toward Richard calmly, deliberately, and held them out. "Here, a certified copy of the deed for this entire plot, recorded at the county clerk's office 3 days ago, along with a fresh survey map, stamped and approved by a licensed surveyor." Richard snatched the papers from David's hand. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. His face, which had been flushed with anger, began to drain of color. "This is impossible," he whispered. "I would have known. Someone would have told me." "You didn't know because you never bothered to check," David said. "You assumed this land was yours. You used it for years without ever paying taxes on it, without ever holding a deed, without ever once verifying who actually owned it. That's not ownership, Richard. That's trespassing. And trespassing is exactly what you've been doing." Richard's hands were shaking. He looked at the survey map, then at the ground beneath his feet, then back at the map. His driveway, his stone walkway, his detached garage. The 3-car garage he had built 10 years ago, the one with the Tesla and the Mercedes and the vintage Porsche he never drove. According to the survey, all of it was sitting on land that no longer belonged to him. "No, that was wrong. That couldn't be right." "You're lying," Richard said, but his voice had lost its force. "This is a forgery. You forged these documents." David laughed. It was a genuine laugh, warm and amused. "Richard, I'm a project manager for a pharmaceutical supply company. I don't know how to forge legal documents, but you're welcome to verify everything with the county. I encourage it, actually. Call them. Right now. I'll wait." Richard didn't call. He didn't need to. He could see the truth in the numbers, in the legal descriptions, in the unmistakable language of the deed. David Morrison, the man he had stolen from, the man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed as too poor and too weak to fight back, had bought the land out from under him. The land Richard had been using for his driveway, his walkway, his garage. "You can't build here," Richard said, grasping at straws. "There's zoning laws, setback requirements. You can't just put up a fence without a permit." David nodded as if expecting this. "I have permits. All of them. Filed and approved. You're welcome to check with the zoning board. In fact, I'd love for you to check, because when you do, you'll also find out something else." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Something about your garage." Richard's stomach dropped. "What about my garage?" David turned to the survey map, pointing at a section near the back of the property. "According to the official city map, your detached garage, the 3-car structure you built without a proper variance, is encroaching 6 feet onto my new land." 6 feet, Richard. That's not a minor overlap. That's a significant portion of your garage. Richard felt the world tilt. "That's not possible. I had a survey when I built the garage. I had permits. I had everything." "You had a surveyor who was paid by your contractor and who never filed the results with the county," David said. "I checked. The original survey from 2012 was never recorded, and the markers your contractor used were off by 6 feet because they used the wrong reference point. Your garage has been on someone else's land for over a decade. That someone just happened to be an old man in Arizona who didn't care. But now that someone is me." Richard stared at the map. The red line, the new property boundary, cut directly through his garage. 6 feet of it, including the bay where he parked his Tesla, was on David's land. The other 2 bays were on his own land. But the structure itself was a single building. "You couldn't split a garage in half. You're gonna have to move it," David said, his voice almost gentle. "Or demolish the encroaching portion, or come to some kind of agreement with me. But the law is clear. You cannot keep a permanent structure on someone else's land without their permission." "Permission," Richard repeated, the word tasting like ash. "I'm open to negotiation," David said. "I'm not an unreasonable man, but we have a lot to discuss. Your fence on my original property, your garage on this new property, your patio extension on the other side. You've been a very busy neighbor, Richard, and now all those bills are coming due." The aftermath of the confrontation. Richard didn't scream anymore. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there, barefoot on his cold walkway, wearing his silk bathrobe, holding a deed that had just destroyed his sense of security. The construction workers had resumed their tasks, ignoring him now. The excavator dug a trench. The concrete barriers were placed in a row. The fence posts went up one by one. David returned to his clipboard, giving instructions to the foreman. He didn't gloat. He didn't rub it in. He simply did what he had come to do, build a fence on his own land. Richard turned and walked back into his house. He closed the door, leaned against it, and slid down to the floor. His phone was in his pocket. He needed to call his lawyer. He needed to call his real estate agent. He needed to figure out how a man he had dismissed as insignificant had just become the most dangerous person in his life. But first, he needed to understand how he had been so blind. 25 years. He had lived in this house for 25 years. He had watched the empty lot next door sit vacant, owned by some absentee investor who never visited, never built, never cared. Richard had mowed that lot. He had parked on it. He had planted shrubs on it. He had treated it as his own for so long that he had forgotten it wasn't. And now, because of his own arrogance, his own laziness, his own refusal to spend a few $1,000s to buy the land properly, he was facing the loss of his garage, his driveway, his pride. He pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer's number. It went to voicemail. Of course it did. It was Saturday morning. He left a message. "Harold, it's Richard. I have a situation. My neighbor bought the empty lot next to my house. He says my garage is 6 feet onto his land. I need you to fix this. Call me back immediately." Then he hung up, closed his eyes, and listened to the sound of David's fence being built, post by post, on land that should have been his. The fence goes up. By noon, the fence was complete. It wasn't a pretty fence. It wasn't cedar from Oregon or redwood from California. It was chain link, galvanized steel, 6 feet tall, with a gate that locked and a sign that read private property and no trespassing. It ran the entire length of the property line, separating Richard's house from the land that was now David's. But David wasn't done. The fence was just the beginning. While Richard watched from his kitchen window, too humiliated to come outside, too angry to stay inside, David's crew began marking the garage. They sprayed orange lines on the concrete floor, showing exactly where the property boundary cut through the structure. 6 feet of the garage, including the Tesla's parking spot, was now on David's side of the line. David walked over to the garage and examined it. It was a beautiful building, insulated, heated, with epoxy floors and built-in cabinets, but was also illegally encroaching, and David now had the legal right to demand its removal. He didn't plan to do that, not yet. He had something else in mind. He pulled out his phone and called Sophia Chun. "The fence is up," he said. "Richard knows about the garage. He's probably panicking right now." "Good," Sophia said. "Don't offer him anything yet. Let him sweat. Let his lawyer call me. We'll negotiate from a position of strength. And the original fence, the one on my property, we'll address that in the same negotiation. He wants to keep his garage, he'll have to move his fence. He wants to keep his patio, he'll have to compensate you for the land he stole. You hold all the cards now, David." David looked at Richard's house, at the dark window where he knew Richard was watching, and smiled. "Thank you, Sophia. I'll call you when his lawyer reaches out." He hung up, walked back to his side of the property line, and sat down on the tailgate of the flatbed truck. He had a cup of coffee and a clipboard full of permits. He had a deed in his pocket and a survey map in his head. And he had a neighbor who had finally learned what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a property dispute. The tables had turned, and David was not going to let them turn back. Monday morning, 8:45 a.m. The emergency injunction hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., but Richard Barrington III arrived at 8:15. He was dressed in a dark navy suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his hair slicked back, his jaw set in a mask of righteous indignation. Beside him sat Harold Finch, the same expensive, silver-haired attorney who had defended Richard's parents in another life, though Richard didn't know that. Finch was calm, collected, and billing $1,200 an hour. David arrived at 8:50. He wore a simple gray suit he had bought off the rack, a white shirt, and a tie his grandmother had given him. He carried a leather portfolio stuffed with documents, deeds, surveys, permits, and the chain of evidence that had taken him months to assemble. Beside him sat Sophia Chun, dressed in a sharp black blazer, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression as unreadable as stone. The courtroom was small, a municipal hearing room, not the grand cathedral where felonies were tried. But Judge Eleanor Vance presided, the same no-nonsense woman who had handled the Mitchell case months ago. She sat behind her bench, spectacles low on her nose, reading the filings with an expression of weary impatience. "This is an emergency hearing regarding a request for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction filed by the plaintiff, Richard Barrington III, against the defendant, David Morrison," the clerk announced. "Both parties are present. All rise." Judge Vance looked up. "Mr. Barrington, your motion argues that Mr. Morrison's construction activities on the property adjacent to your home are causing irreparable harm and should be halted immediately. Mr. Morrison, you have filed a cross motion to dismiss and for sanctions. I've read both. Let's hear your arguments, and let's keep them focused. I have 3 other cases this morning. Richard's lawyer, Harold Finch, rose smoothly. Thank you, Your Honor. My client, Richard Barrington III, has resided at 215 Elm Street for 25 years. During that time, he has maintained, improved, and relied upon the property located at 217 Elm Street, the so-called vacant lot, as an integral part of his homestead. He has mowed the grass, planted shrubs, parked his vehicles, and used the land openly, notoriously, and without objection from the previous owner for over a decade. He paused, letting that sink in. Mr. Morrison purchased this lot 3 weeks ago, knowing full well that my client had an established use of the property. Now, Mr. Morrison is constructing a fence and has threatened to demolish my client's detached garage, which has stood for 12 years. We are asking for an emergency injunction to stop all construction pending a full hearing on the question of adverse possession and equitable easement. Judge Vance raised an eyebrow. Adverse possession? You're claiming your client owns the lot through adverse possession. We are asserting a colorable claim, Your Honor, Finch said smoothly. 25 years of open, notorious, continuous, and hostile use. That's the standard. My client has met it. Has he paid property taxes on the lot? Finch hesitated. No, Your Honor. The previous owner paid the taxes. Then your adverse possession claim is dead on arrival, the judge said flatly. In this state, adverse possession requires payment of taxes. You can't claim ownership of land you never paid a dime to the government for. Finch pivoted. Then we seek an equitable easement. My client's garage has been in place for 12 years. He spent over $80,000 building it. Demolishing it would cause extreme hardship. Mr. Morrison can be compensated with money. The garage should remain. Judge Vance turned to Sophia Chun. Ms. Chun, your response. Sophia stood slowly, deliberately. She placed a stack of documents on the table in front of her, then walked to the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, the plaintiff's motion is not just meritless. It is a textbook example of bad faith. Mr. Barrington did not accidentally use land that wasn't his. He deliberately stole land from his neighbor, and now he is trying to steal again through the courts. She held up a large, color-coded survey map. This is a survey of Mr. Barrington's property and the adjacent lots, conducted by a licensed engineer 3 months ago. It shows that Mr. Barrington built a fence 4 feet, 3 inches onto Mr. Morrison's original property, the property where Mr. Morrison lives. That fence destroyed Mr. Morrison's flower beds, his gravel path, and his peaceful enjoyment of his own land. She placed the map on an easel. When Mr. Morrison confronted him with the survey, Mr. Barrington laughed in his face. He said, and I quote from Mr. Morrison's sworn affidavit, "My contractors don't make mistakes. Go ahead and sue me if you want, but my lawyers will drag this out for years until you're broke." The judge's expression hardened. Is that accurate, Mr. Finch? Finch shifted in his seat. My client denies using those exact words, Your Honor. The affidavit is sworn, Sophia said, and we have a witness who overheard the conversation, Mr. Morrison's brother, who was on the phone at the time. We can produce him if necessary. Judge Vance waved her hand. Continue. Sophia turned back to the map. Instead of suing, Mr. Morrison chose a different path. He researched the ownership of the adjacent vacant lot. He discovered that it was owned by an elderly gentleman in Arizona who had been trying to sell it for years. Mr. Morrison purchased that lot legally for fair market value, with his own savings and a modest loan. He recorded the deed. He obtained proper building permits. He did everything by the book. She picked up a second map. Then he had a new survey done of the entire area, including Mr. Barrington's property. That survey revealed something extraordinary. Mr. Barrington's detached garage, which he built 12 years ago, is encroaching 6 feet onto the newly purchased lot. His driveway extends 2 feet onto it. His stone walkway is also over the line. She placed the map next to the first. So let's review the record. Mr. Barrington built a fence on Mr. Morrison's original land. He used a vacant lot that didn't belong to him for years without paying taxes. And now, when the rightful owner of that vacant lot exercises his legal rights, Mr. Barrington runs to court asking for an injunction to stop him. Sophia faced the judge. Your Honor, this is not a dispute between neighbors. This is a pattern of entitlement, aggression, and bad faith. Mr. Morrison is not seeking to demolish the garage tomorrow. He is not seeking to evict Mr. Barrington from his home. He is simply building a fence on his own property, a fence that Mr. Barrington has no legal right to stop. She returned to her seat. We ask that the motion for an injunction be denied with prejudice, and that the court order Mr. Barrington to pay Mr. Morrison's legal fees for this frivolous filing. The judge's questions. Judge Vance leaned back, tapping her pen against the bench. Mr. Finch, your client's position seems to be that he can take other people's land, use it for years, and then claim a right to keep it because he got used to it. That's not how property law works. Finch stood again, his composure slightly shaken. Your Honor, my client is willing to negotiate. He is not unreasonable. He is willing to pay Mr. Morrison fair market value for the strip of land on which the garage sits. He is willing to grant an easement for the driveway. He simply wants to avoid the catastrophic expense of demolishing a perfectly good structure. He should have thought of that before he built it on someone else's land, the judge said dryly. But I'll hear from Mr. Morrison directly. Mr. Morrison, you have the right to speak on your own behalf if you wish. Do you have anything to add? David stood up. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. Thank you, Your Honor. He walked to the center of the courtroom, facing the judge. He did not look at Richard, who was glaring at him from the defense table. Your Honor, I bought my house 5 years ago. It's not a mansion. It's a modest 2-bedroom ranch. But it's mine. I worked hard for it. I planted a garden. I built a bench under the maple tree. I was happy there. He paused. Then Richard built a fence on my land. He destroyed my flower beds. He stole 4 feet of my yard. When I showed him the survey, he laughed at me and told me his lawyers would bankrupt me if I tried to sue. The judge's eyes narrowed. And did you try to sue? No, Your Honor. I couldn't afford it. I was told a civil lawsuit would take 2 years and cost tens of thousands of dollars. So I looked for another way. I found that vacant lot. I bought it. I did it legally with my own money and a loan I'll be paying off for years. He took a breath. I'm not trying to destroy Richard's garage. I'm not trying to ruin him. But I'm not going to let him steal from me and then use the courts to protect his theft. What do you want? The judge asked. David turned to face Richard for the first time. I'm willing to negotiate. I'm willing to let him keep his garage standing on my new land on one condition. The courtroom was silent. He has exactly 48 hours to tear down his fence on my original property. Every single plank. He has to restore my yard, my flower beds, my gravel path, my soil, to the way it was before he stole it. And he has to pay me $20,000 in damages for the emotional distress, the legal fees, and the cost to the surveys. Richard's face went red. That's extortion, he shouted, jumping to his feet. Sit down, Mr. Barrington. Judge Vance snapped. You will have your turn. Richard sat, fuming. The judge turned back to David. Those are your terms? Yes, Your Honor. He tears down the fence on my original land, restores my yard, and pays me $20,000. In exchange, I will grant him a permanent easement for his garage, the 6 feet that encroach onto my new lot. He can keep his garage standing. He can keep using his driveway. We both walk away with something. And if he refuses, then I exercise my full legal rights. I demand that he remove the garage at his own expense. I sue him for trespass and for the original fence encroachment. And I let the courts decide, slowly, expensively, for both of us. Sophia, Chin stood up. Your Honor, my client is being extraordinarily reasonable. He is offering Mr. Barrington a way out that costs far less than demolishing a garage or fighting a multi-year lawsuit. We ask that the court deny the injunction and encourage the parties to settle on these terms. Richard's last stand. Harold Finch asked for a recess to consult with his client. Judge Vance granted 10 minutes. In the hallway, Richard paced like a caged animal. He can't do this. He can't just demand $20,000. That's blackmail. Finch sighed. Richard, listen to me. He has the law on his side. The garage is on his land. The fence is on his land. You have no valid adverse possession claim because you didn't pay taxes. The judge is already hostile. If this goes to trial, you will lose. You will lose the garage. You will lose the fence. And you will pay his legal fees. So I'm supposed to just write him a check? After he humiliated me, you're supposed to cut your losses, Finch said. $20,000 is nothing compared to what it would cost to demolish and rebuild a 3-car garage. And tearing down that fence? You should have done it months ago. Richard slammed his fist against the wall. I hate him. Hate him later. Write the check now. They returned to the courtroom. Judge Vance looked at them expectantly. Your Honor, Finch said, my client is willing to discuss a settlement, but he needs more time. 48 hours is unreasonable. He asked for 30 days. David stood up. Your Honor, he's had months. He's had every opportunity to do the right thing. He chose to mock me instead. 48 hours is generous. Judge Vance nodded. I agree. Mr. Barrington, you have 48 hours to comply with Mr. Morrison's terms. Tear down the fence, restore the yard, and pay $20,000. In exchange, Mr. Morrison will grant you an easement for your garage and will not pursue further legal action. If you fail to comply, the injunction is denied with prejudice, and I will schedule a full trial on the merits. And let me be clear, I will not look kindly on a defendant who has repeatedly acted in bad faith. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Finch put a hand on his arm. "We accept the terms, Your Honor," Finch said. Richard turned to him, aghast. "What?" "We accept," Finch repeated firmly. "We will comply within 48 hours. Judge Vance banged her gavel. "So ordered. Court is adjourned." The aftermath. David walked out of the courthouse into the bright morning sun. Sophia fell in a step beside him. "That went better than I expected," she said. "I thought he'd fight to the bitter end." "He did," David said. "His lawyer saved him from himself." Finch knows when to fold. $20,000 isn't nothing, Sophia said, and tearing down that fence will be humiliating for him. He'll have to watch his contractors undo all that expensive work. David smiled. "I'll make sure to sit on my bench and drink coffee while they do it." Sophia laughed. "You've earned it. But remember, he has 48 hours. If he doesn't comply, we go back to court, and then we take his garage." "He'll comply," David said. "He's a bully, but he's not stupid. He knows when he's beaten." They reached the parking lot. David shook Sophia's hand. "Thank you for everything. Don't thank me yet. Wait until the check clears." David drove home. He passed Richard's house, still standing, still grand, but now with a new chain-link fence cutting across the western edge. He parked in his driveway, walked to his backyard, and looked at the cedar fence. The fence that had stolen his flower beds, his peace, his sense of security. In 48 hours, it would be gone. He sat down on his wooden bench under the maple tree, pulled out his phone, and set a timer. 47 hours, 59 minutes, and counting. He smiled, leaned back, and waited. 47 hours later, the signing. The conference room at Sophia Chin's office smelled like coffee and victory. David sat at the polished wooden table, a pen in his hand, reading the settlement agreement for the third time. Across from him, Richard Barrington III sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above David's left shoulder. Harold Finch, Richard's attorney, sat beside his client, his expression carefully neutral. Sophia stood at the head of the table, summarizing the terms one last time. Mr. Barrington agrees to remove the entirety of the fence constructed on Mr. Morrison's original property at 213 Elm Street, including all posts, planks, and concrete footings. He agrees to restore the affected portion of Mr. Morrison's yard to its original condition, including soil grading, replanting of destroyed vegetation, and replacement of the gravel path. He agrees to pay Mr. Morrison the sum of $20,000 as compensation for damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. In exchange, Mr. Morrison grants Mr. Barrington a permanent, non-transferable easement for the 6-foot encroachment of the detached garage onto the newly acquired lot at 217 Elm Street. The easement does not extend to any other structures or future expansions. She looked at Richard. "Do you understand these terms, Mr. Barrington?" "I understand," Richard said through gritted teeth. "And do you agree to them voluntarily, without coercion?" "I agree." Finch nodded. "My client signs." Richard picked up the pen, scrawled his name on the dotted line, and pushed the document away as if it had burned him. David signed next, his signature calm and deliberate. Sophia countersigned as witness, and Finch added his own signature as counsel for the defendant. "The original will be filed with the court," Sophia said. "Copies for both parties. Mr. Barrington, you have 24 hours to begin demolition. The full $20,000 is due within 72 hours. Richard stood up abruptly. "It'll be in his account by tomorrow morning. I want this over with." He turned and walked out of the conference room without looking at David. Finch followed, pausing at the door to give David a nod that might have been respect or might have been resignation. Then they were gone. David sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "It's done." Sophia smiled. "It's done. Congratulations, David. You won." "We won," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." She waved a hand. "I just filed the paperwork. You did the hard part, the research, the purchase, the patience. Most people would have given up after the first survey. You didn't." David stood up, folded his copy of the agreement, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "What happens if he doesn't pay? Then we go back to court, and I ask the judge to hold him in contempt. But he'll pay. His ego is bruised, but his bank account is intact. $20,000 is pocket change to a man like Richard. The humiliation is what stings." "Good," David said. The humiliation was the point. The demolition, day one. The crew arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. David had hired Miguel again, the same contractor who had built the chain-link fence on the vacant lot. But this time, the work was on David's original property, and the work was demolition. Miguel stood at the edge of the cedar fence, running his hand along the expensive planks. "This is beautiful wood. Shame to tear it down." "It was stolen wood," David said, "built on stolen land. It needs to go." Miguel shrugged. Your money. Your call. The crew worked quickly. They started at the far end, removing the decorative caps, then the planks, then the horizontal rails. The cedar boards were stacked neatly. David planned to sell them or donate them to a habitat restoration project. The concrete footings were dug out with a small excavator, leaving holes that would need to be filled with fresh soil. By noon, half the fence was gone. By 3 p.m., the last plank was down. The property line was open again, bare, raw, but honest. For the first time in months, David could see the full expanse of his yard, from a maple tree to the eastern hedge. But the fence was only the beginning. Richard's concrete patio, the massive, expensive extension that had been poured on the stolen strip of land, was next. Miguel's crew brought in jackhammers. The noise was tremendous, a percussive roar that echoed through the neighborhood. Neighbors came out to watch. Some of them waved at David. A few gave him thumbs up. Richard did not come outside. David saw the curtains twitch in his kitchen window, but the man himself remained hidden. The concrete broke apart in chunks, revealing the compacted gravel beneath. The fire pit was dismantled. The gas line was capped. The pergola was disassembled, its cedar beams carried away in pieces. By the end of the second day, the patio was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble that a separate crew hauled away in dump trucks. David stood in the empty space, looking at the exposed soil. It was compacted, lifeless, nothing like the garden he had cultivated. But it was his again, and he would restore it. The restoration. The third day brought topsoil. Miguel's crew spread 6 inches of rich, dark loam over the entire area where the fence and patio had sat. They graded it carefully, sloping it away from David's house for drainage. Then they planted new hydrangeas, the same variety David had lost, along with lavender, rosemary, and a row of flowering shrubs that would bloom in sequence from spring to fall. The gravel path was rebuilt, wider than before, with decorative stepping stones that David had picked out himself. A small bird bath went in near the maple tree. A new bench, sturdier than the old one, was placed facing east toward the sunrise. David worked alongside the crew, his hands in the soil, his knees in the dirt. He planted every hydrangea himself, pressing each root ball into the earth with the care of surgeon. By the end of the week, the yard looked better than it had before Richard's fence had ever existed. And the $20,000? It arrived on Tuesday morning, wired directly into David's account. He stared at the balance for a long time, then called Sophia. The money is here. Good. What are you going to do with it? David looked out his window at the chain-link fence on the vacant lot. The lot he had bought, the lot that held Richard's encroaching garage. The chain-link was functional but ugly. It was a temporary solution. Now, he had the funds to build something permanent. I'm going to build a fence, he said. A beautiful one, on my new land. A new fence. David hired an architect, not a fancy one. A young woman named Elena who had just started her own firm and charged reasonable rates. He told her what he wanted, a fence that was both a barrier and a statement. A fence that would block Richard's view of the vacant lot completely. A fence that would be legal, beautiful, and impossible to ignore. Elena designed a masterpiece. It was a privacy fence, 8 feet tall, the maximum height allowed by zoning, constructed of western red cedar, stained a warm honey color. The planks were arranged in a board-on-board pattern, with no gaps, no visibility. At the top, a subtle angle gave it a modern look. Along the base, a row of planters would hold climbing roses and jasmine. The fence ran the entire length of the vacant lot, 120 feet of solid cedar. It faced Richard's house. From his kitchen window, from his living room, from his master bedroom, all he would see was wood. No sky, no trees, no sunsets, just a wall. David submitted the plans to the zoning board, paid the permit fees, and scheduled the construction. Miguel and his crew broke ground on a Monday. Richard watched from his window. David saw him there, a silhouette behind the glass, as the first post went into the ground. The holes were dug deep, filled with concrete, reinforced with steel brackets. The posts were set perfectly plumb, rising like sentinels along the property line. By Wednesday, the horizontal rails were up. By Friday, the planks were installed. By Saturday morning, the fence was complete, 8 feet of solid cedar, stretching from the street to the back alley, blocking every inch of Richard's western view. David stood on his side of the fence, the vacant lot side, and admired it. The wood was beautiful, warm, organic. The climbing roses had been planted, their roots settling into the planter boxes. In a few months, they would bloom, softening the wall with color and fragrance. On Richard's side, there was nothing but a wall. The community garden. The vacant lot was 4,800 square feet, a generous patch of land. The fence now occupied the western edge, but most of the lot was still open, still empty, still waiting for a purpose. David could have sold it. He could have built a house on it, rented it out, turned it into a parking lot. But none of those options felt right. The lot had been neglected for years, used as Richard's private dumping ground for trash and political signs. It deserved better. He thought about his own garden, the joy he found in planting, nurturing, watching things grow. He thought about his neighbors, many of whom were elderly or lived in apartments without yards. He thought about the kids on the block who had nowhere to play except the street. The idea came to him slowly, then all at once. A community garden. He pitched it at the next neighborhood association meeting. The response was overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman next door, offered to help with the paperwork. The young couple across the street promised to build raised beds. A local hardware store donated tools and seeds. Even the homeowners association, usually a source of petty bureaucracy, approved the plan unanimously. David used a portion of the $20,000 to fund the garden. He installed a simple irrigation system, a small tool shed, and a picnic table under a shade cloth. He marked out 20 plots, each 10 by 10 feet, and offered them to neighbors for a nominal fee, just enough to cover water and maintenance. The plots were claimed within a week. Mrs. Patterson took two, one for vegetables, one for flowers. The kids across the street planted pumpkins. A retired schoolteacher started a butterfly garden. A young family grew tomatoes and basil. The garden became a hub of activity. On weekends, neighbors gathered to weed, water, and chat. Children ran between the rows, chasing butterflies. Dogs sniffed at the fence line, wagging their tails. The empty lot that Richard had taken for granted was now the heart of the community. And Richard? He could hear the laughter through his walls. He could smell the jasmine and roses that climbed the fence. He could see, from his upstairs window, the tops of sunflowers bobbing in the breeze. But he could not see the garden itself. The 8-foot fence blocked everything. He had stolen David's land. David had bought the land next door. And now, Richard lived in a beautiful house surrounded by walls and fences and the sounds of a community that wanted nothing to do with him. The final scene, 1 month later. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. David sat on his new bench under the maple tree, a glass of iced tea in his hand, his bare feet resting on the grass. The hydrangeas were blooming, deep blue and purple, more vibrant than ever. The lavender swayed in the breeze. The gravel path glittered with tiny mica flakes. His yard was whole again, better than whole. It was a sanctuary. He looked to his left, where the new fence stood, solid cedar, 8 feet tall, covered in climbing roses. Beyond it, he could hear the gentle murmur of his neighbors tending their plots in the community garden. A child laughed. A dog barked. Someone was playing a guitar. He looked to his right, where Richard's property began. The old fence was gone. The patio was gone. In their place, a simple border of shrubs marked the true property line, the line that should have been there all along. Richard's house was quiet. The curtains were drawn. The Tesla was in the driveway, but there was no sign of its owner. David had heard through the grapevine that Richard had stopped attending neighborhood events. He had stopped waving at people. He had become a recluse, hiding behind his walls and his shame. David felt a flicker of something that might have been pity, but only a flicker. Richard had made his choices. He had stolen. He had mocked. He had tried to use his wealth to crush a man who had done nothing wrong. And in the end, his wealth had bought him nothing but a wall and a lesson he would never forget. David took a sip of his iced tea and closed his eyes. The air was warm, soft, full of the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. The birds were singing their evening songs. The world was at peace. He thought about the cake, not Richard's fence. The cake from another life, another story. The $400 cake that had been the best investment he ever made. That cake had bought him freedom. This fence had bought him peace. He opened his eyes and smiled. Best investment I ever made, he said to no one in particular. And then he sat back, watched the sunset, and enjoyed the quiet. 6 months later, the community garden won a local award for Best New Green Space. David was invited to a ceremony at City Hall, where the mayor shook his hand and a reporter took his picture. The article ran on the front page of the local paper, above the fold. Richard saw it. He was standing in his kitchen, drinking his morning coffee, when he glanced at the headline. Neighbor turns vacant lot into thriving community garden after legal battle. The photo showed David, smiling, holding a trowel, surrounded by children and flowers. Richard crumpled the newspaper and threw in the trash. He walked to his window and looked out at the fence, the beautiful, solid, 8-foot fence that blocked his view of everything he had once taken for granted. He could not see the garden. He could not see the neighbors. He could not see the sunsets. He turned away from the window and walked into his dark living room. Outside, the roses bloomed. The children laughed. The garden grew. And David sat on his bench, at peace, finally, absolutely victorious.